speaker, and it's an absolute delight to introduce Professor Peter Hotez. I'm sure many of you have heard the name. Peter was one of the original group to launch the brand of NTDs, and he launched PLOS NTDs, which gave us a focused journal to publish some of the research from the NTD community. More recently, his career has changed radically as a defender of vaccines and scientific evidence. And I think there's no better introduction than to give you the title of a recent Lancet profile of Peter, which is physician, scientist, and warrior combating anti-science. So my hope is that Peter will now be behind me. Hello, Peter.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry I can't be there in Liverpool personally. I love visiting, and I've been to Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine many times, and unfortunately not since the pandemic, so I'm well overdue for a repeat visit. But, you know, I can't tell you enough how thrilled I was to receive this invitation, and in part, I think with all the delays, it stopped moving. Let me reshare, and I'll try to ad lib while I'm resharing here. You know, this has been such an inspirational place for me, and so much so that during one of the visits, I had this idea that it would be wonderful to actually see if we could reproduce something like the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine here in the United States. And this is what gave birth to our school here in the vast Texas Medical Center called the National School of Tropical Medicine. And it was very much established with my long-term aspirational goal to build something like LSTM here in North America. Now, of course, you have a 100-year head start, so we still have a long way to go. We're still quite modest in size. We only have about 20 faculty members, but we're growing, and so thank you for the inspiration. I also want to give you a sense of our new emblem. I'm not allowed to call it a logo, I'm told by the university administrator, so it's called an emblem. So apparently there's a difference between a logo and an emblem, but I'm very much looking at your Egyptian-themed Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine. I thought, well, since a lot of our activities are in the New World, why don't we come up with a New World theme? And one of our faculty members had the brainstorm of using the Mayan jaguar for our logo. But even that was very much inspired by LSTM. So thank you again for this great invitation. And the way I'm going to begin is to talk about one of the most common questions I'm asked during the pandemic, because we made a low-cost COVID vaccine. I was interviewed a lot on the cable news channels, and one of the most common questions that I would ask, both on camera and off camera, was on the upper right, and literally the question was, "Hey, Doc, what the heck is going on?" That was the question. It took some time to kind of unravel, okay, what are they really asking? What they're really asking is, why do we seem to be seeing this regular cadence of pandemics, and beginning in this new century of SARS in 2002, you remember severe acute respiratory syndrome came out of southern China, and then hit Toronto, then H1N1, and then Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome and Ebola in 2014. Then we had Zika here in Texas and Florida in 2016, and then Ebola, of course, was the horrific epidemic in West Africa that I know many of you were involved with. Then we had Ebola again in 2019, then the largest of them all, COVID-19, caused by SARS-2 in 2019. Now we're dealing with a really problematic H5N1 avian flu, and that began in Texas, where I am, and spreading up into the Great Plains states, and now in California, and many of us are expecting a SARS-3 to come about before the end of this decade, and I'll explain why in a minute. And that's what's being well publicized. Kind of flying below the radar screen is the fact that on our in where I am in Texas and on our Gulf Coast area in South Florida, we've seen a sharp increase in tropical infectious diseases. We just had a new dengue case here in Texas, and we've been seeing that now on a more regular basis. Chikungunya and Zika. That little map at the bottom is from the Institute for Health Metrics. Simon Hamey has shaped out a predictive map of where we can expect to have Aedes aegypti on a pretty regular basis, including here in Houston, going across to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, and then into Florida. We've had malaria now transmission in South Texas and South Florida, leishmaniasis, and we've been finding a fair bit of hookworm in the southern United States. People have often said it's been eliminated. It's not. It's still prevalent. So the question is why, and I don't have the answer. So it's still speculative, but I'd written a book in 2021. I started writing books around a decade or more ago. And this one is in 2021 called Preventing the Next Pandemic. And it looks like, and it really tries to address the what the heck is going on question on what are the 21st century drivers of these diseases. Now, there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure you've been speaking about it at the conference, about climate change, and clearly that's an important force. But one of the observations that we've made, it's not climate change in isolation, it's climate change acting in concert with other big picture 21st century drivers, particularly social determinants such as urbanization is a big one, poverty, and then political instability. And I'll finish up talking about this growing anti-science activity. So let me quickly just go through some of these forces. The climate change is a big concern. I'm working on a new book with my colleague Michael Mann on the left from the University of Pennsylvania. He came under attack for inventing what's called the hockey stick a couple of decades ago. Like I get under attack for my defensive vaccines, he came under attack for climate science. Now we're writing a new book together that'll be out next year called Science Under Siege. But the assaults on him began when he proposed this hockey stick. And the hockey stick says if you lay a hockey stick on the ground with the blade facing up, looking at the sharp rise of temperatures over the last 100 years has been really impressive. So this steep acceleration in temperatures, and with it catastrophic weather events, altered rainfall patterns. And so that reflects the big changes, and we're seeing this definitely in the Gulf Coast and Texas with our warming temperatures, so much so that the UN Secretary General doesn't even bother calling it global warming anymore. He calls it global boiling. So that seems to be a big factor in helping drive why we're seeing vector-borne diseases and others in Texas and the Gulf Coast, as well as in Southern Europe. But that's not the only thing that's going on. The other is these very aggressive urbanization that's happening. So for the first time now on our planet, more people live in urban areas than in rural areas. And for decades, for more than 100 years, the three largest and only megacities in the world, meaning more than 10 million people, were London, New York, and Tokyo. And that's all shifted now as we've seen this steep rise in megacities growing in low and middle income countries in the global south. So we've got, of course, Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata and India and Dhaka and Bangladesh and Kinshasa now in the DR Congo and Lagos in Nigeria and Luanda and Angola and Dar in Tanzania and in Latin America. And by 2030, the United Nations estimates there'll be 41 such megacities globally. So if you kind of think about the way the world is heading towards, it's a bit dystopian. There's a picture of Sao Paulo on the upper left there, and I believe that's Kinshasa on the upper right. Basically, the coalescence of the world's population into hot and sweltering megacities, hot and sweltering due to climate change, and with that crowding, increase respiratory infections, vector-borne diseases. And so this is what I think one of the big future trends that we're addressing here, for the simple reason that it's accelerating where I am in Texas. So Texas has a population of about over 30 million people, roughly the population of Canada, but the population is highly concentrated in the cities in that triangle on the lower right. We call it the Texas Triangle, and it means it's Dallas and Fort Worth at the top of the triangle, where I am in Houston, Texas, on the lower right, and then as you head towards the left, Austin and San Antonio. And they are indeed hot and sweltering megacities. So for our School of Tropical Medicine, we're really looking at what are the interventions for this future of hot and sweltering megacities, especially in the new world. And with that, this is our Texas Medical Center, where I've been at now for 14 years. It's amazing. I've been here for 14 years, and I think most of the times I've been visiting Liverpool and David Molyneux, even meeting people like our Professor Gillies was when I was at George Washington University. But I moved to Texas about 14 years ago and came to this, we do everything big in Texas. This is the Texas Medical Center. It's the world's largest medical center, the first medical city of 120,000 employees and 60 institutions, including the MD Anderson Cancer Center and Baylor College of Medicine, of course, and Texas Children's Hospital, which is the world's largest children's hospital, and came there with the idea that this would be a pretty good place to tap into the resources for global health and building the School of Tropical Medicine. And with that, we also created a center for vaccine development. So as many of you know, I've been making vaccines for decades, and that's been my major laboratory research interest. And we've built within the School of Tropical Medicine this Center for Vaccine Development called the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development, which is about 20 plus scientists and co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 20 plus years, Dr. Mary Elena Batazzi, with the idea that we would try to make the vaccines that the big pharma companies would not be interested in. So we have a vaccine for hookworm anemia that I'll talk about, for schistosomiasis. We have a malaria vaccine, a Chagas vaccine. And the way we got involved with making COVID vaccines was interesting. More than a dozen years ago, we were approached by a group at the New York Blood Center, Shibu Jiang and Lan Yingdu, who kind of said to us, hey, Peter, just like nobody really cares much about your parasitic disease vaccines, no one cares about our coronavirus vaccines. At that time, they were making vaccines for SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, and Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. Basically said, would you work with us? And how could I turn down that offer? So we wrote grants, got supported. We began making SARS and MERS vaccines so that when COVID-19 hit, we were able to pivot and make that vaccine reaching 100 million people in India and Indonesia, and I'll talk briefly about that. Trying to provide a pathway for our vaccines that bypass the big pharma companies, since they're generally not interested in our portfolio, in our disease targets, because they only affect people living in extreme poverty. In fact, we even try to call our vaccines the anti-poverty vaccines, because, as you can imagine, one of the hard parts to sell in the sense of our vaccines to the policymakers is diseases like schistosomiasis and hookworm anemia and Chagas disease tend not to be high mortality diseases. And historically, vaccines are only for high mortality illnesses, but these are more chronic and debilitating conditions. So how do you get people to care about enough to invest in a vaccine? And we try different messaging, but one of them that seems to have been effective is to say that these illnesses not only occur in the setting of poverty, but they promote poverty because of their impact on child growth and development. And this is the first book that I wrote called Forgotten People, Forgotten Diseases, that describes the opportunity of working on these conditions. And a lot of the book actually talks about the work ongoing at LSTM. Now, our approach for making these vaccines is, yes, we try to do the cool and innovative technologies like mRNA vaccines and particle vaccines, et cetera. But we also do this. We try to be compatible with vaccine producers in low and middle income countries that are represented by the blue dots in Asia, on the African continent, and Latin America. And they actually brand themselves as the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network, DCVMN. And as I said, there's 40 of them. And one of the most widely used technologies they have is they make their own recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine. And this is done as a recombinant protein vaccine done through microbial fermentation in yeast, either Baker's yeast, Saccharomyces, or methanol-utilizing yeast such as Pichia or Hensenula. And they genetically engineer the yeast and grow it up in big bioreactors, almost like the process of making beer, except the yeast are releasing recombinant protein antigens rather than fermenting and releasing alcohol. And what's nice about it is there's no limit to the amount you can make. It's very inexpensive, probably the lowest cost vaccines out there. It's very safe. And parents trust it because they've been vaccinating their kids for hepatitis B for a long time. So our approach is, when possible, we try to make the production cell bank in our laboratories at Texas Children's Hospital, actually making vaccine, and then we'll send it via World Courier to the vaccine producer for them to scale, and then we work with them on the scale up. So we'll do the scale up at the 5, 10, 20 liter fermentation scale, and then they'll do this at a much larger scale. And it's been a fairly effective approach. And I don't have to tell this group that this is one of the problems that we face, is where these diseases are located. So on the right is an article I wrote with Simon Brooker, and then did a subsequent paper with David Molyneux, looking at the geographic overlap of hookworm and malaria, and they're both spot on. Wherever you see the green, and with that is the additive anemia, and having long conversations with people like Professor Imelda Bates and others at Liverpool, where there's a lot of strengths in hematology and anemia, talking about this synergism or additive effects of anemia. And then on the left is the overlap of hookworm and schistosomiasis in the purple and in the hatched lines. And what I like to say is, imagine if you're the chief executive officer of a biotech or a pharma company. This is probably not the map you want in your business plan, because where's your financial return? Your financial return is in the U.S. and Canada, North America, and the U.K. and the European Union and in Japan. So one of the things that we struggle with is, what is the business model? What is the sustainable finance model for developing something like a vaccine, which can require large-scale investments, particularly as you're getting to the phase 3 clinical trial stage and in the industrial scale manufacture. Our original vaccine that I started a long time ago, 40 years ago, as an MD PhD student in Anthony Cerami's lab, was to select this as a target. And I remember with great fondness conversations with Professor Gillies, who also devoted a lot of time and effort to studying hookworm anemia. You can imagine the complications of this as a vaccine target, much more complicated than a virus or a bacterium. It's an animal. It's a nematode that embeds deep into the intestinal mucosa and removes blood, and children and pregnant women tend to be the most vulnerable because they have low underlying iron stores and develop anemia. This is actually a picture, a movie of an endoscope of a colleague of mine in Hyderabad at the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, finding a hookworm on endoscopy, and there's the blood around the outer edges of the worm as it's feeding. It injects an anticoagulant that we discovered, a factor 10A inhibitor, and then it's ingesting the blood, and the blood courses through the body of the worm, and that barber pole effect is the worm's reproductive organs in the white, and then blood courses through the body of the worm to cause anemia. The other aspect of it is with Simon Brooker, who's now at the Gates Foundation, we found that the thermal tolerance of hookworm larvae in the soil is quite high, even higher than Ascaris eggs or Trichuris eggs in the soil. So as the soils on the African continent start to bake, as well as in India, the predictions are this is going to be a predominant parasite on the African continent and in South Asia. So because the hookworm larvae seem to withstand the effects of climate change quite readily. And this is an article I wrote as a graduate student a long time ago with Anthony Cerami, looking at the potential antigens for vaccination. And then we began quite a long quest to look at the mechanisms by which hookworms feed on blood, doing this with a group of collaborators, including Alex Lucas and Mark Pearson, now at James Cook University in Australia, initially with us. And this is a cartoon where the hookworm is entering into capillaries or arterioles in the submucosa, ingesting the red blood cells. And then this is a cross-section of the hookworm gut, which is breaking open the red blood cells through a hemolysin. And then attached via brush border membrane are a series of proteolytic enzymes that break down the hemoglobin stepwise through the actions of an aspartic protease, a cysteine protease, a metalloprotease. And we found that that hemoglobin is the major nutrient source for the worm, number one. And secondly, all of these enzymes, if you administer them as a recombinant protein to an animal, makes a pretty good vaccine. They induce virus-neutralizing antibodies that are taken up by the worm while feeding on blood, because the antibodies are in the plasma, neutralizes the enzymes and interferes with the worm's nutrition. Eventually, the worm dies. But the best vaccine of all was one involved in heme detoxification. So after the hemoglobin is digested, releasing the heme component, hookworms bind up the heme through a specially modified glutathione transferase, which has not much of a peroxidase function, but serves as a heme sink. And it turns out malaria has this enzyme as well, although they also have an alternative, which is they polymerize the heme into an inert pigment, hemozoin. But the GST is quite interesting. Toyin Asojo and our group solved the X-ray crystal structure, identified the heme binding function, and we found it was making a great vaccine in the laboratory in hamsters challenged with Necator americanus, or even a mouse model of Nipostrongylis brasiliensis. This was found by Nima Briggs, who is an MD PhD student with us and now starting his own lab at Yale. And we began a series of clinical trials through support initially from the Gates Foundation, then a European consortium based out of the Amsterdam Institute of Global Health and Development, to take these enzymes, particularly the GST, which was the most promising, through phase 1, phase 2 clinical trials. And that was going okay, and a lot of these were done in Gabon and also in Brazil. But what was happening was we were experiencing donor fatigue. The donors would say, the funders would say, hey, Peter, it's great progress, but it's not moving as fast as we'd like. And by the way, you're going to get to the point where you want us to invest in a fairly expensive phase 3 clinical trial, as well as the industrial scale manufacturing, to see, first for the phase 3 trial, to see if it actually works in protecting against hookworm as it does in animals. And we don't really want to do that investment to see if it works, ... unless we already know it works. So what do you do with that? And the answer was, they recommended that we do a human challenge model of infection. They said it should take you 7-8 months. And so we did it, but it didn't take 7-8 months. It took 7-8 years, because we're doing this under an IND, a new investigational new drug application with the FDA. So when we were at Washington, it was started by Jeff Bethany and David Demert, working at the human challenge model of infection, where they would infect human volunteers with 50 hookworm larvae on the skin. And then the larvae would go through the usual life cycle to the afferent circulation to the right side of the heart, and the lungs break out of lung capillaries into the alveoli, ascend the alveoli, cross over the epiglottis, and then the larvae would enter the stomach and intestinal tract, and that's when the eosinophilia started, and then they start feeding on blood. And now we were ready to test the vaccine. I was a little skittish in the beginning because imagine if you're giving 50 hookworm larvae, you're talking probably about a dozen of those worms are becoming fully adults and producing eggs. So you're asking for a vaccine to look at the effect of roughly, a dozen or more worms, and unless you have high levels of protection, you're not going to get the statistical significance. But David released the result at the end of last year at the ASTMH meeting, and these are the maximal egg counts in the controls. This is the recombinant protein on alum, which is some protection, and this is the recombinant protein on alum together with the TLR9 agonist, the CpG oligonucleotide. We got 100% protection, which is better than we would have imagined. And it not only stopped the worms, but it also stopped the eosinophilia as well. And so presumably as the larvae entering into the gut, we showed this is when they turn on the GST molecule and start producing it as adults. So it actually made sense that it was stopping the eosinophils, and it correlated with antibody. So this is very exciting, but the question is now what? Because even though we can do cost effectiveness studies, and we can de-risk the investment by showing that it works in a challenge model. You still have to get the investors. And so what I'm doing is a fair bit of shuttle diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, going to the vaccine producers that made our COVID vaccine that I'll talk about in a minute, and such as Biological E in India and Hyderabad, or Biopharma in Indonesia, to say, could you roll the dice with us on this as well? And the problem there is for COVID, the deal was with the vaccine producers in India and Indonesia, they had an arrangement with their governments, the Indian and Indonesian government, that's basically said, you make it, you show it works, we'll guarantee the advanced purchase of 300 million doses because it was COVID. But for something like hookworm anemia, it doesn't have that same sense of urgency, and this is where we get into the problem of neglected tropical diseases. So, what is the policy? What is the procurement strategies going to Biological E in Hyderabad and going to the Indian government, talking to people in Delhi, but also going to the World Health Organization in Geneva and the NIH to really see how we're going to get this made and delivered. With COVID, it wasn't as problematic because it was COVID. We were able to make a vaccine in our labs at Texas Children's that worked with Biological E, and this became the primary vaccine used for India. It's the same recombinant protein technology and yeast together on alum together with the CpG oligonucleotide. Just to briefly tell the story there, this is what we were facing in 2021 as vaccines were being rolled out in the UK and the US and Canada and elsewhere. This left bereft the usual suspects. So this is a map of the unvaccinated world, a bubble map, where people on the African continent, India, Pakistan, South Asia, and Indonesia were not getting vaccines, in part because I believe there was a science policy failure. There was so much emphasis on speed and innovation, and we got some really interesting vaccine technologies, mRNA and particle vaccine. But as any engineer will tell you, when you focus on a brand new technology, there's a learning curve before you go from 0 to the 15 billion doses that were needed globally. And so what happened was predicted and predictable. Enough doses were made with the new technologies, mRNA and particles, to be bought up by the US and Canada, UK, and elsewhere, and that left the low and middle income countries out in the cold. So we were getting frantic phone calls from ministers of health and ministers of science. And what we decided to do is do the tech transfer with vaccine producers that we trusted, and do it with no patent, no strings attached, to make it easy, because it's a recombinant protein technology that they had familiarity with, that they could scale it up. And we did this with India, Bangladesh, we did this with Indonesia, and even started something with Botswana. And India and Indonesia went the furthest. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Can I ask you just to wrap up?
So I will do that then. And we were able to make this happen very quickly and show the level of virus neutralizing antibody, and then the step-down studies in kids. And then we wound up doing this in Indonesia, making the halal version because of the fact that it's a vegan technology. So it provided proof of concept that we can do this. And I'll finish here in that that's the really good news part of the story. But the not so good news is we're not progressing as fast as we had hoped, in part because of the social disruptions due to COVID-19, but also the fact that superimposed on this is a very aggressive anti-vaccine movement that's expanding. So that's a picture of me in the monk painting over there. And this is what we're fighting now in the U.S. So, and this will be my last slide. I started as an MD PhD student in New York, wanting to make vaccines for the world, arguably doing that. The other side is I have 4 adult kids, including Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities, wound up writing this book, Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. That wound up making me public enemy number 1 or 2. And unfortunately now, with some of the new appointments and the new Trump administration and other activities that were happening, we're seeing this big, massive onslaught. And we had 200,000 unnecessary deaths in the U.S. from COVID, from people who refused to get a COVID vaccine during the Delta and BA1 wave. And now it's spilling over to all childhood immunizations. So I'll end with a warning that this is now being exported to low and middle income countries as well. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you, and I look forward to following up with you in the coming weeks and months, and eventually getting to come and see you to come visit. So thank you again.